deep in the shadowed forests of Native American folklore, where ancient whispers curl between the trees, there lurks a terror far worse than any beast or spirit. These are not the towering monsters of legend, but something far more unsettling: small, twisted figures with insatiable hunger. The Teiheehan. Imagine creatures no taller than a child, with jagged teeth and eyes that gleam like firelight, stalking the edges of villages, waiting to drag the unwary into the dark. You might know tales of werewolves or vengeful ghosts, but the Teiheehan are different. They don't just kill, they consume, and they've been hiding in the stories of tribes like the Cherokee and Iroquois for centuries, passed down as warnings, as nightmares, as something you pray you'll never meet. By the time this video ends, you'll understand why these cannibal dwarves are among the most chilling figures in folklore, and why some still swear they hear their laughter in the woods at night. Stay close to the fire, let's begin. Now let's travel back to where it all began, the origins of the Teiheehan. These aren't just campfire tales spun for chills. They're deeply rooted in the traditions of Native American tribes, especially the Cherokee and Iroquois peoples. Picture the dense forests and rugged mountains of their homelands, places where shadows stretch long and the unknown feels unnervingly close. It's no surprise these landscapes birth stories of cunning, hunger-driven creatures. The Cherokee, for instance, spoke of the Teiheehan as more than monsters. They were warnings, stories told to children about straying too far into the woods, or to hunters about the dangers of venturing out alone at night. The Iroquois, meanwhile, wove them into their oral traditions as symbols of chaos, reminder of nature's unpredictable wrath. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were survival lessons wrapped in terror. Geography played a huge role in shaping these myths. Isolated valleys, echoing caves, and thick forests became the perfect hunting grounds for the Teiheehan in these stories. And because these tribes relied on oral storytelling, details shifted slightly from one generation to the next. Sometimes the creatures were more ghostly, other times shockingly physical. But one thing never changed. The Teiheehan embodied the fear of what lurked just beyond the safety of the village fire. What's fascinating is how these stories traveled. Trade routes and intertribal gatherings spread the Teiheehan's legend, blending it with local fears and landscapes, until versions of the same creature appeared in different tribes under different names. Yet whether whispered by Cherokee elders or recounted in Iroquois longhouses, the core message remained: some hungers can't be satisfied, and some dangers are smaller, sneakier, and far closer than you think. But if these creatures were fearsome warnings, what exactly made them so terrifying? Let's peel back the shadows and get a closer look at the Teiheehan's monstrous form. Imagine stumbling upon one in the woods. Your first clue wouldn't be size, but that gut-churning wrongness. They stood no taller than a child, yet their proportions were twisted, limbs slightly too long for their stunted bodies, fingers ending in claws that could shred bark or flesh. Tribal descriptions spare no horror. The Cherokee spoke of mouths stretched too wide, crammed with needle-like teeth designed not for chewing, but for ripping. Their eyes, often described as sunken and gleaming with a sickly yellow light, seemed to pierce the dark like a predator's. The Iroquois added another layer, skin like mottled tree bark, making them nearly invisible among the roots and rocks until it was too late. Some accounts even mention a stench, something rancid clinging to them, a warning sign for those who dared venture too deep into their territory. What unsettled storytellers most wasn't just their appearance, but how it played tricks on the mind. In certain tales, the Teiheehan could almost pass for human at a distance until they moved. Their gait was wrong, jerky, and insect-like, or unnervingly fluid, as if bones weren't quite solid. And then there was the sound, not quite laughter, not quite speech, but something in between, a chittering that echoed just behind you, even when no one was there. These weren't generic monsters. Their forms were crafted from the very landscapes tribes feared, gnarled like old wood, quick as river mist, hungry as winter. Every detail served a purpose, to make sure listeners never forgot what waited in the dark, and if you're picturing something that makes your skin crawl. Good, that means the stories are still working. Now that we've seen their horrifying appearance, let's delve into what makes the Teiheehan truly monstrous, their behavior. These weren't just creatures lurking in the shadows, they were hunters, and humans were their preferred prey. The forests and caves they called home weren't just hiding places, they were hunting grounds, carefully patrolled and marked with unsettling signs for those who knew how to read them. Villagers whispered of snapped twigs arranged in strange patterns, or stones stacked in ways that defied the wind, warnings that the Teiheehan were near. Their cannibalism wasn't just about hunger, it was ritualistic. Tribal accounts describe how they devour victims alive, savoring their terror as much as their flesh. Some stories claim they believed consuming human strength would make them more powerful, twisting the act into something darker than mere survival, and they didn't hunt blindly. The Teiheehan were cunning, using the landscape itself as a weapon. They'd mimic lost children's cries to lure rescuers into traps, or leave false trails that led travelers deeper into the wilderness, where the trees grew too thick to escape. But perhaps their most disturbing tactic was patience. Unlike beasts that attacked in frenzy, the Teiheehan would stalk their prey for days, studying habits, learning weaknesses. Hunters might return to camp to find their supplies subtly disturbed, or catch movement just beyond the firelight, always fleeting, never enough to confirm. By the time a victim realized they were being hunted, it was often too late. The Teiheehan didn't just want flesh, they wanted fear, and they knew exactly how to cultivate it. This wasn't random violence. Every action served their twisted rules, a code as old as the tribes that feared them. And if you're wondering why no one fought back, oh, they tried. But that's a story for another section, one that reveals just how the Teiheehan turned survival into a game they always won. Now, let's step back and ask the bigger question: why did these terrifying stories exist in the first place? The tales of the Teiheehan weren't just campfire frights. They served a deeper purpose in Native American cultures, woven into the fabric of daily life as carefully as any lesson or ritual. For many tribes, these stories functioned as stark, cautionary warnings. Parents would recount the Teiheehan's tricks to children, teaching them to stay close to the village, avoid wandering into dense forests at dusk, and never follow strange sounds alone. The dwarves became a living metaphor for the dangers of curiosity without caution, a reminder that the wilderness, though vital for survival, demanded respect. But the lessons went beyond mere obedience. The Teiheehan's patience and cunning mirrored real threats: predators, harsh winters, or even hostile neighboring tribes. By personifying these dangers, the stories made abstract risks feel immediate and unforgettable. Yet there's another layer here. In many Native American traditions, myths weren't just practical guides, they were spiritual maps. The Teiheehan's grotesque hunger reflected taboos against greed and excess. Some scholars argue they symbolized the consequences of breaking communal harmony, a warning against selfishness that could consume a person from within. Other interpretations tie them to shamanic beliefs, where crossing into forbidden territories, physical or spiritual, invited monstrous retribution. What's fascinating is how these themes echo across tribal storytelling. Whether as bogeymen for children or embodiments of natural balance, the Teiheehan fit into a broader tradition where monsters weren't just villains, but teachers. Their stories preserved hard-won wisdom, ensuring each generation understood the unseen rules of survival both in the forest and within the community itself. And if you think that's chilling, wait until we compare them to other cannibal legends. Because the Teiheehan weren't alone in their hunger, they had cousins, far more infamous, lurking in the myths of other cultures now. Let's widen the lens and see how the Teiheehan stack up against other legendary horrors. While they share a taste for human flesh with infamous figures like the Wendigo or skinwalkers, these dwarves carve out their own terrifying niche. Take the Wendigo, for example, a towering, emaciated beast born from Algonquian lore. Unlike the Teiheehan's small, grotesque forms, the Wendigo embodies insatiable hunger in a skeletal frame, growing larger with every meal. Both creatures warn against greed, but where the Wendigo is a solitary force of winter's starvation, the Teiheehan hunt in packs, relying on teamwork and trickery. Then there are the skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo traditions. While they share the Teiheehan's predatory cunning, their power lies in transformation, wearing the skins of animals to stalk their prey. The Teiheehan, by contrast, don't disguise themselves. They lean into their horrifying appearance, using their dwarfism to seem harmless before striking. And unlike skinwalkers, who are often seen as corrupted humans, the Teiheehan are wholly otherworldly, creatures born from myth rather than fallen from grace. What truly sets the Teiheehan apart, though, are their tribal-specific rituals. In Cherokee tales, they're tied to sacred caves and whispered chants, while the Iroquois depict them as spirit messengers blurring the line between monster and omen. These nuances reflect how deeply each tribe's environment and beliefs shaped their cannibal myths. The Wendigo might be a universal symbol of gluttony, and skinwalkers a caution against dark magic, but the Teiheehan, they're a mosaic, each tribe's stories adding another piece to their chilling legend. And speaking of tribal variations, the Cherokee versions of these dwarves hold secrets all their own. Now, shifting our focus to the heart of Cherokee lands, we uncover the Teiheehan's unique role in their folklore. Among the Cherokee, these cannibal dwarves weren't just bogeymen, they were deeply woven into the spiritual and physical landscape. Picture this: dense Appalachian forests where every shadow might hide their stunted forms, and sacred caves echoed with their eerie laughter. The Cherokee believed these creatures lurked near limestone caverns, which were considered portals to the spirit world. This tied the Teiheehan to both earthly and supernatural realms, making them doubly dangerous. Unlike other tribes' portrayals, the Cherokee versions often emphasize the Teiheehan's connection to water. Some elders spoke of them dragging victims into rivers or lurking near waterfalls, their voices blending with the rushing water to disorient travelers. This regional twist reflects the Cherokee's reverence for waterways, seeing them as life-giving but also home to unseen threats. Ceremonial defenses against the Teiheehan were just as nuanced. Cherokee shamans performed going-to-water rituals, purifying themselves in streams to repel the dwarves' influence. Families hung carved wooden masks near doorways, their grotesque features meant to confuse or scare the creatures away. And there was one strict rule: never whistle at night. The Cherokee believed the Teiheehan would mimic the sound, luring the whistler into the dark. Perhaps most fascinating are the regional variations within Cherokee communities themselves. In the mountainous areas, stories describe the Teiheehan as more aggressive, scaling cliffs to snatch children. Meanwhile, valley-dwelling clans painted them as tricksters who'd steal food rather than flesh unless provoked. This diversity shows how geography shaped the myth, adapting the terror to local landscapes. But the Teiheehan's legacy didn't stop at scare tactics. They served as a moral compass, too. Cherokee parents warned that greed or disrespect toward nature would summon them, teaching balance in a world where humans weren't always the apex predators. Up next, we'll see how the Iroquois envisioned these dwarves with a startlingly different twist, turning northward to the Iroquois nations. We find a striking contrast in how these cultures envisioned the Teiheehan. Far from the relentless hunters of Cherokee lore, the Iroquois often portrayed these beings as cunning tricksters, mischievous shapeshifters who blurred the line between warning and wisdom. In the vast woodlands of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, elders spoke of Teiheehan appearing as flickering lights in swamps, luring wanderers off safe paths only to vanish with echoing giggles. One haunting tale from the Mohawk people tells of a Teiheehan disguising itself as a lost child, its too wide smile hidden by shadows. When a kind-hearted hunter carried the child home, it waited until midnight to reveal its jagged teeth, not to attack, but to scold the man for ignoring his grandmother's teachings about forest dangers. Here, the creature served less as a monster and more as a stern teacher, enforcing cultural taboos through fear. The Seneca traditions added another layer, linking Teiheehan to prophetic dreams. Shamans interpreting visions of the dwarves believed they foretold societal unrest like droughts or conflicts with neighboring tribes. A chilling account describes a clan mother dreaming of Teiheehan gnawing on maple roots, which tribal seers correctly interpreted as a warning of failed harvests. This spiritual dimension turned them into omens rather than outright threats. Yet the Iroquois didn't dismiss their danger. The Onondaga told of Teiheehan poisoning careless hunters' food caches, while the Cayuga whispered about them stealing voices, mimicking loved ones to draw victims into abandoned longhouses. What unified these stories was the creature's role as enforcers of balance, punishing those who violated nature's laws or community harmony. Unlike the Cherokee's monstrous devourers, the Iroquois versions were paradoxes, both educators and executioners. This cultural divergence reveals how the same myth adapts to different worldviews. Where Appalachian tribes emphasized physical terror, the Iroquois wove the Teiheehan into their intricate web of dreams, morality, and collective memory. Next, we'll arm you with ancestral knowledge, practical survival tactics tribes used to outwit these dreaded beings. But knowledge alone wouldn't save you from the Teiheehan tribes' passed down survival strategies honed over generations. Let's uncover the wisdom ancient communities relied on to outsmart these nightmarish dwarves. First and foremost, timing was everything. Villagers from the Cherokee to the Seneca strictly avoided forests after sunset, when Teiheehan were believed to prowl most actively. Daylight offered safety, as many tribes claimed the dwarves shunned the sun's glare. Those who traveled at dusk carried torches not just for light, but because flickering fire was said to repel them, mimicking the protective glow of the spirit world. Next came the power of sacred objects. Shamans crafted charms from materials Teiheehan supposedly feared, bundles of owl feathers, pouches filled with white ash, or necklaces strung with river pearls. The Cherokee favored carved juniper amulets, while the Iroquois swore by tiny drums filled with blessed corn. These weren't mere superstitions, they served as psychological armor, emboldening travelers to walk confidently through Teiheehan territory. Perhaps the most crucial skill was reading environmental warnings. Tribes taught children to spot signs of the dwarves' presence: unnatural silence in usually chatty bird flocks, footprints too small for human children, or trees with claw marks at waist height. The Mohawk told of twisted saplings forming arches, a trap where Teiheehan would drop onto victims' backs. Even cooking practices held clues, leaving food unattended in the wild invited contamination, as the creatures were infamous for poisoning meals with hallucinogenic fungi. When confrontation was unavoidable, oral traditions prescribed countermeasures, speaking certain words backwards, a practice among the Onondaga, was said to confuse the dwarves' mimicry. Others carried mirrors, believing Teiheehan would flee upon seeing their own grotesque reflections. If all else failed, tribes like the Cayuga advised feigning death, as the creatures supposedly lost interest in motionless prey. These tactics reveal more than folklore. They're a survival blueprint forged through observation and trial. Every warning carried practical roots. Night travel was genuinely perilous. Poisoned food posed real dangers, and environmental awareness could mean life or death. The Teiheehan myth distilled these lessons into unforgettable terrors, ensuring they'd never be forgotten. Now, let's venture deeper into the spiritual realm, where these dwarves transcend flesh and bone, becoming something far more enigmatic. But beyond their terrifying flesh and blood presence, the Teiheehan straddled a blurry line between the physical and spiritual realms. Tribal beliefs varied wildly. Were these dwarves monstrous creatures of bone and teeth, or something far more supernatural? Among the Cherokee, shamans spoke of the Teiheehan as corrupted spirits, once human souls twisted by ancient curses or unspeakable acts of cannibalism. Rituals to banish them often mirrored ceremonies used against vengeful ghosts, involving smoke purification and chants to break their ties to the living world. Some accounts describe them vanishing into mist when confronted with sacred herbs, suggesting a spectral nature. Yet the Iroquois traditions leaned toward a chilling hybrid theory. Their oral histories depict the dwarves as flesh-eaters who could slip between worlds, becoming invisible at will. Medicine men claim Teiheehan left no footprints in snow or mud when they didn't wish to be tracked, and that they drew power from crossing thresholds, doorways, riverbanks, even the edges of firelight. This liminal quality made them particularly dangerous during rituals or dreams, when the veil between realms was thin. Contrast this with the Seneca perspective, where the dwarves were undeniably physical, but created by dark magic. Legends tell of sorcerers molding them from clay and nightmare, breathing life into miniature bodies to serve as spies or assassins. Their cannibalistic hunger wasn't metaphorical. It was a flaw in their unnatural creation, like a furnace that could never be stoked enough. What united these views was the role of spiritual defenses. Across tribes, protections against the Teiheehan always involved shamanic tools, drumming to disrupt their connection to the spirit world, circles of salt or ash as dimensional barriers, and most tellingly, the burning of certain woods believed to cleanse corrupted energy. Whether they were monsters or ghosts, the solution was never merely brute force, but a reckoning with forces beyond human sight. Now, let's examine a provocative question. Could there be tangible evidence behind these legends? Delving into the realm of physical traces, whispers of archaeological findings tied to the Teiheehan myth have sparked debate for decades. Among the most controversial are a series of petroglyphs discovered in Cherokee territories, depicting small, hunched figures with exaggerated teeth, some clutching what appear to be human limbs. While researchers argue these could symbolize spiritual warnings, tribal elders maintain their literal records of encounters. More heated still are the claims of dwarf-sized skeletons unearthed near ancient Iroquois settlements. 19th century excavation reports mention remains buried with peculiar traits, jaws filed into points, bones stained with ochre, and fractures suggesting ritualistic violence. Skeptics dismiss these as misidentified child burials or genetic anomalies, but fringe theorists insist they match descriptions of the Teiheehan's unnatural physiology. Then there's the infamous Devil's Oven cave system in Seneca lands, where early settlers reported finding charred bones and tiny handprints pressed into clay walls. Forensic analysis in the 1990s revealed cut marks on some bones consistent with defleshing, yet archaeologists caution this could reflect mortuary practices rather than cannibalism. The truth remains tangled, much like the Teiheehan themselves, between fact, fear, and the stories woven to explain the unexplainable. What's undeniable is how these fragments, real or imagined, fueled colonial-era hysteria. European settlers, already primed by their own folklore of goblins and imps, eagerly conflated native accounts with sensationalized proof. Newspapers of the 1800s ran lurid headlines about pygmy graveyards, often exaggerating or fabricating details to sell copies. This cultural lens distorted the original myths, layering European fears onto indigenous lore. So where does that leave us? While no conclusive evidence pins the Teiheehan to physical remains, their persistence in oral tradition and the eerie overlap of certain artifacts invites us to wonder. Perhaps the real proof lies not in bones or cave art, but in the universal human instinct to give form to the horrors that lurk just beyond the fire's glow. And speaking of outsiders reshaping the myth, let's turn to how European colonists interpreted and altered these tales when they crossed paths with native storytellers. When European colonists first heard tales of the Teiheehan from native tribes, they didn't just listen, they reshaped the stories through the lens of their own fears. Settlers, already steeped in superstitions about goblins, imps, and dark forest spirits, saw eerie parallels in these accounts, but their retellings often twisted the original myths, grafting European horrors onto indigenous lore. One chilling example comes from a Puritan diary in the late 1600s. A fur trader described encountering little devils in the woods near Iroquois lands, claiming they had eyes like coals and a taste for stolen children. Yet tribal versions of the tale never mentioned kidnapping, only that the Teiheehan lured the greedy or disrespectful. The settler's account, dripping with Christian imagery of demons, reflects how cultural bias warped the narrative. By the 1800s, newspapers amplified the hysteria. Sensational headlines warned of red pygmies lurking near frontier towns, blending Cherokee descriptions with racist caricatures. A notorious 1843 article in the Boston Courier even claimed settlers found a goblin village with tiny huts, though no such structures were ever documented by tribes. These fabrications served a darker purpose, justifying displacement of native communities by painting their lands as haunted, cursed places. Yet some colonists took the legends more seriously. Folklorists like Charles Leland, recording stories in the late 19th century, noted how settlers in Appalachia adopted tribal taboos, refusing to whistle at night or leave food unattended, fearing it would attract the little people. Here, the myth evolved into something new, a hybrid of indigenous warning and immigrant survival instinct. What gets lost in these retellings? The Teiheehan's original role as teachers. Many tribal stories framed them as punishers of greed or disrespect for nature, not mindless monsters, but colonists projecting their own fears of the wilderness and its original inhabitants, stripped away these lessons. So next time you hear a goblin tale from early America, ask, whose story is it really? Because folklore, like history, is often written by those who hold the pen or the printing press. And as we move into modern times, the Teiheehan's legend takes yet another turn, with reported sightings and hoaxes keeping the myth alive in surprising ways. But what happens when an ancient legend collides with the internet age? Fast forward to the 20th century, and the Teiheehan myth takes on a bizarre new life. In the summer of 1972, a group of hikers in the Ozarks claimed to find strange, child-sized footprints leading to a cave. When they followed them, they reported hearing high-pitched laughter and the distinct sound of cracking bones. News outlets ran wild with the story, but park rangers later found evidence the tracks were faked, likely a prank inspired by local folklore. Then came the digital era, where myths spread faster than ever. In 2010, a grainy YouTube video titled "Real Cannibal Dwarf Caught in Tennessee Woods" went viral, showing a shadowy figure darting between trees. The uploader insisted it was proof the Teiheehan still lurked in Appalachia, but eagle-eyed viewers noticed the creature moved suspiciously like a person in costume, and the video was quietly deleted after skeptics pointed out editing glitches. Yet despite the debunking, forums and chat rooms kept the story alive, with some swearing they'd seen similar figures near abandoned mines or old tribal lands. Not all modern accounts are so easily dismissed. In 2017, a Navajo hunter in New Mexico reported finding half-eaten animals arranged in eerie, ritualistic patterns, something tribal elders linked to old Teiheehan warnings. No hoax was ever uncovered, leaving even researchers puzzled. And as recent as 2021, a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains documented unnerving screeches on a wildlife camera, sounds that matched no known animal. Could it be coincidence, overactive imaginations, or something older, darker, slipping through the cracks between legend and reality? Here's the twist. The more technology tries to expose these stories as fakes, the more the mystery deepens. Because every debunked hoax seems to spawn another, even more elaborate tale. And that's the power of folklore. It thrives not on proof, but on the human love of a good story. So whether the Teiheehan are lurking in the shadows or just lurking in our collective imagination, one thing's certain: they're not disappearing anytime soon. Now let's shift gears and see how these terrifying dwarves leaped from campfire tales to pop culture icons. Stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight, the Teiheehan have left their mark far beyond tribal tales. These cannibal dwarves have crept into modern pop culture, reshaping horror in ways that blur the lines between folklore and fiction. Take video games, for instance. While the Wendigo famously haunted players in Until Dawn, indie titles like The Wild Hunt drew direct inspiration from Teiheehan myths, casting them as forest-dwelling predators that stalk players through moonlit woods. The game's designers exaggerated their features' glowing eyes, elongated limbs, but kept their eerie mimicry of human voices, a chilling nod to the original legends. Books, too, have given the Teiheehan new life. Horror novelist Illy Graves wove them into his bestseller Bone Whisperers, reimagining them as ancient spirits cursed to devour the living. Though he took liberties adding a backstory involving colonial witchcraft, the core fear remained: something small, swift, and merciless lurking just beyond the firelight. Meanwhile, Cherokee author Alyssa Littlefox took a different approach in The Hollow Ones, sticking closely to tribal oral traditions. Her Teiheehan weren't monsters, but tragic figures twisted by hunger, a nuance often lost in mainstream retellings. Then there's film. Low-budget horror movies love a good monster, and the Teiheehan's blend of primal terror and obscurity makes them ripe for adaptation. The cult hit Crawl Space featured dwarfish creatures ambushing campers, though critics noted they resembled generic ghouls more than the cunning hunters of folklore. In contrast, the documentary Whispers in the Dark consulted native elders to portray the Teiheehan authentically, even using traditional drumming to recreate the sounds said to lure victims. But here's the catch: the more pop culture embraces these creatures, the further they drift from their roots. Video games amp up the gore for shock value. Novels graft on new mythologies. Movies prioritize jump scares over cultural context. Yet this evolution isn't entirely a bad thing. Every retelling, no matter how loose, keeps the Teiheehan alive in our collective imagination, and sometimes it leads audiences back to the original stories. After all, what's more terrifying? A Hollywood monster, or knowing these tales once kept entire villages awake at night? Now, let's peel back another layer. What if the Teiheehan aren't just monsters, but mirrors? Next, we'll explore what psychologists make of these enduring nightmares. Digging deeper into the shadows of the mind, the Teiheehan might reveal more about human psychology than ancient terrors. What if these cannibal dwarves aren't just bogeymen, but symbols of our deepest, unspoken fears? Psychologists have long studied how folklore acts as a mirror reflecting societal anxieties, and the Teiheehan are no exception. Through a Freudian lens, their relentless hunger could symbolize repressed fears of scarcity, a primal dread of famine buried in the collective unconscious. Imagine living in a time when winter meant starvation, when a failed hunt doomed a village. The Teiheehan, with their gnashing teeth and insatiable appetites, become living embodiments of that terror, a way to give shape to the invisible threat of hunger. But there's another layer. Carl Jung might argue the Teiheehan represent the shadow self, the dark, rejected parts of humanity we refuse to acknowledge. Their small stature and grotesque features could mirror how societies often depict their fears as twisted, lesser versions of themselves, making the unknown feel both alien and eerily familiar. The way they mimic human voices, that's the uncanny valley of the psyche, where something almost human triggers instinctive revulsion. Tribal warnings to avoid the woods at night weren't just about physical danger. They were lessons in confronting the chaos lurking within, teaching generations to master their own inner wilderness. Then consider the outsider theory. In many cultures, the other, whether strangers, rival tribes, or even the mentally ill, has been mythologized as monstrous. The Teiheehan's habit of lurking at the edges of villages, watching, waiting, might encode ancient suspicions of those who lived beyond the community's boundaries. Their cannibalism, a grotesque exaggeration of the fear that outsiders would consume resources, land, or even cultural identity. It's no coincidence that these tales surged during times of conflict or migration, when the threat of the other felt most palpable. Yet perhaps the most haunting interpretation ties the Teiheehan to the wilderness itself. For Native American cultures, the forest was both provider and predator, a place of bounty and peril. The Teiheehan's embodiment of that duality, creatures born from the land yet hostile to humans, could symbolize nature's retribution against those who disrespect it. Starve the earth, and it might just starve you back. So next time you hear a twig snap in the dark, ask yourself, are you afraid of monsters or of what they represent? Because the Teiheehan's greatest trick isn't hiding in the trees, it's hiding in us. Now, let's turn to the very name they whisper in the night. What secrets lie buried in the word Teiheehan? Now, let's unravel the mystery hidden within the name itself. What does Teiheehan truly mean? The word carries echoes of ancient languages, and its roots vary slightly depending on the tribe. Among some Cherokee storytellers, Teiheehan is said to derive from words meaning little devourers, a chilling nod to their insatiable hunger for human flesh. Imagine hearing that name whispered around a fire, a warning wrapped in just 2 syllables, but not all interpretations focus on their appetite. In certain Iroquois traditions, the name leans closer to whispering ones, a reference to their eerie habit of mimicking voices to lure victims. Picture a traveler hearing their own mother's voice calling from the trees, only to stumble into a trap. The name becomes a perfect mirror of their tactics: silent, deceptive, deadly. Digging deeper, some linguists suggest the word might also tie to older Proto-Algonquian roots meaning those who crawl, a nod to their dwarf-like stature and way of moving unseen through the underbrush. It's a reminder that every piece of their name reflects their behavior, like puzzle slots clicking into place. And here's the twist: the name wasn't just a label, it was a weapon. Many tribes believed saying Teiheehan aloud at night could draw their attention, as if the word itself summoned them. That's why some stories refer to them indirectly, calling them the small ones or the forest people, a linguistic shield against their hunger. So whether it means devourers, whisperers, or crawlers, the name Teiheehan is more than just a title, it's a key to understanding their legend. Now, let's explore the rituals tribes used to keep these creatures at bay, because knowing their name was only the first step, surviving them required much more. But knowing the name was just half the battle. Next came the rituals and taboos that tribes relied on to keep the Teiheehan at bay. These weren't just superstitions, they were survival strategies, honed over generations to outwit creatures that lurked in the shadows. One of the most widespread taboos, never speaking their name after dark. It was like ringing a dinner bell, utter Teiheehan when the sun went down, and you might just invite them to your campfire. Instead, people used coded phrases like the ones who walk low or the hidden mouths, words that wouldn't catch their attention. Even children learned this rule early, like a grim version of "don't talk to strangers." Then there were the rituals. Smoke ceremonies were common, burning sacred herbs like sage or cedar to purify a space and repel the dwarves. The idea was simple. Teiheehan supposedly couldn't stand the smell, as if the smoke burned their lungs as badly as their presence burned human flesh. Families would often line their doorways with ash, a symbolic barrier that said, "Keep out," in a language the dwarves understood. Drumming played a role too, especially among the Iroquois. The steady, thunderous beats weren't just music, they were a weapon. Stories tell of hunters lost in the woods who pounded on logs or shook rattles to disorient the Teiheehan, scrambling their mimicry like static over a voice. Some tribes even carved drums with their distorted faces, a way of stealing their power through art. But perhaps the most chilling ritual was the false trail, a trick straight from the Teiheehan's own playbook. If you suspected they were tracking you, you'd walk backward in your own footsteps, then suddenly veer off into a stream or climb a tree. The goal: make them follow their own hunger in circles until dawn, when sunlight forced them back into hiding. These practices weren't just about fear, they were about control. By turning the Teiheehan's own tricks against them, tribes reclaimed some power in a world where these dwarves could strike anywhere. And that's the irony: the very creatures who taught humans to fear the dark also taught them how to fight back. Now, let's step into a fascinating contrast: how the Teiheehan stack up against their European counterparts, the dwarves of Norse and Germanic folklore. At first glance, both are small in stature, but their roles in mythology couldn't be more different. Where European dwarves are often master craftsmen, forging legendary weapons like Thor's hammer, the Teiheehan are pure predators, their skills honed for hunting, not hammering. Take their relationship with humans, for example. In Norse sagas, dwarves might bargain or even aid heroes. Think of the magical ring unwary, crafted by dwarves but coveted by gods and mortals alike. The Teiheehan, though, their only trade is terror. No alliances, no gifts, just a hunger that drives them to stalk and slaughter. Even their dwellings reflect this. European dwarves live in underground forges or glittering halls, while the Teiheehan lurk in caves and thickets, places where the light never quite reaches. Then there's the matter of their origins. Norse dwarves were born from the bones of a primordial giant, Ymir, shaped by the gods themselves. They're part of the world's fabric, tied to destiny and divine order. The Teiheehan, by contrast, seem to erupt from the darkest corners of the wilderness, less created than emergent, like a nightmare that took form from the fears of those who first spoke their name. And let's not forget appearance. European dwarves might be gruff or ugly, but they're rarely described as grotesque. The Teiheehan, with their jagged teeth and hollow eyes, are designed to unsettle. It's as if Native American lore distilled every dread of the unknown into their form, while European tales tempered their small folk with a touch of respect, or at least usefulness. This split reveals something deeper about the cultures behind the myths. In Europe, dwarves often symbolized the hidden gifts of the earth's precious metals, crafted wonders. But in Native American lore, the Teiheehan embodied the land's merciless side, a reminder that nature doesn't just provide, it predates. Two visions of the world, carved into the shape of small, sharp-toothed beings. Up next, we'll explore how these stories weren't just told to frighten, they played a vital role in shaping the young, testing them in rituals that blurred the line between myth and survival. But beyond mere cautionary tales, the Teiheehan played a darker, more transformative role in tribal life, especially for the young. Among certain Native American communities, these stories weren't just told around the fire for chills. They were tools of initiation, woven into rites of passage that marked the crossing from childhood to adulthood. Picture this: a teenage boy, isolated in the forest overnight as part of his coming-of-age trial. The elders might whisper of Teiheehan lurking nearby, their breath hot on the wind, the goal, to confront fear itself. This wasn't just about bravery, it was a symbolic death and rebirth. By enduring the terror of the little devourers, the initiate proved they could survive the wilderness's harshest truths. In some tribes, this ritual mirrored the Teiheehan's cannibalism in metaphor, the consumption of the child's old self, replaced by a stronger, wiser adult. These ceremonies reveal a profound cultural insight. The Teiheehan weren't just monsters, they were teachers. Their stories forced the young to grapple with primal fears, starvation, isolation, the unknown. By facing them, even in legend, initiates learned resilience. Some traditions took it further, incorporating physical trials like fasting or scarification, blurring the line between myth and bodily endurance. Interestingly, this practice finds echoes worldwide, from African lion dances to Viking berserker rites, where youth face symbolic predation to emerge renewed. But the Teiheehan's role was uniquely tied to the land. Their myths didn't just test courage, they bonded initiates to the terrain itself, its dangers and gifts. Survive the night, and you weren't just an adult, you were part of the forest's balance, no longer prey but protector. Now, let's unravel how these dwarf-like terrors might reflect something even deeper, not just human fears, but nature's own relentless logic. Moving beyond their role in tribal rites, the Teiheehan may have served as living metaphors for the unforgiving forces of nature itself. Think of how famine creeps in silently, gnawing at the edges of survival, much like these dwarves, who were said to stalk the hungry and unprepared. In seasons of scarcity, their myths likely took on new urgency, embodying the very real threat of starvation that haunted Native American communities. But their symbolism ran even deeper. Just as wildfires purged the forest to make way for new growth, the Teiheehan's cannibalism mirrored nature's brutal cycles. Some scholars suggest their stories reinforced a sacred rule: take only what you need from the land or face consequences. Tribes like the Cherokee spoke of the Teiheehan targeting those who overhunted or wasted resources, painting them as enforcers of ecological balance. Consider, too, how predators like wolves or bears were revered and feared in equal measure, both providers and punishers. The Teiheehan's duality echoed this relationship. Their small stature belied a monstrous power, much like a venomous snake hidden in the brush. By personifying nature's unpredictability, these tales taught respect for every element, from the mightiest bison to the tiniest venomous insect. Perhaps most strikingly, their myths may have foreshadowed the consequences of disharmony. When European settlers disrupted native lands, some tribes interpreted droughts or disease as the Teiheehan's vengeance, nature itself consuming those who threw its balance into chaos. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a profound understanding that humanity's survival depended on humility toward the natural world. Now, let's examine how modern storytellers have grappled with retelling these layered legends, and why some tribal voices argue their true meaning has been lost in translation. Shifting our focus to modern times, we encounter a thorny debate surrounding the Teiheehan legends. As these stories gained popularity beyond tribal communities, many Native American scholars and elders raised concerns about cultural appropriation. Imagine a sacred family heirloom being displayed in a museum without permission, its meaning stripped away for entertainment. That's how some tribal members view outsiders retelling these myths without understanding their spiritual weight. One major criticism centers on financial gain. Non-native authors and filmmakers often profit from sensationalized versions of the Teiheehan, reducing them to generic horror monsters. Take best-selling horror novels that borrow the dwarves' cannibalism, but erase their connection to environmental teachings. Cherokee storyteller Joseph Bruchak once compared this to stealing the bones of our ancestors to build someone else's house. Accuracy suffers too. New Age books sometimes blend the Teiheehan with unrelated entities like European goblins, creating fictional hybrids that never existed in tribal lore. The Iroquois version, for instance, portrays them as spiritual omens, not the mindless killers seen in some video games. Without tribal input, these distortions spread like wildfire, burying authentic traditions under layers of misconception. Yet there's hope. Contemporary Native creators are reclaiming these narratives through projects like the award-winning anthology Living Ghosts and Mischievous Monsters, which features Teiheehan stories told by indigenous voices. The key difference: these retellings honor original contexts, whether it's the Cherokee emphasis on resource ethics or the Iroquois focus on spiritual warnings. For those eager to explore these legends respectfully, seek out sources vetted by tribal councils or indigenous scholars. After all, true understanding begins when we listen to the voices these stories belong to, not just the ones retelling them. Now, let's turn to an equally fascinating dimension: how Native artists have captured the Teiheehan's terrifying essence through carvings, masks, and textiles across generations. Art offers a powerful lens into how Native communities visually conjured the terror of the Teiheehan. Stepping into the realm of tribal artistry, we find masks and carvings that bring these cannibal dwarves to life in chilling detail. Cherokee artisans often depicted them with grotesquely exaggerated teeth, not just to signal their hunger for human flesh, but also to embody the consequences of greed and gluttony. Those jagged, oversized incisors served as a visceral warning, distorting the human form just as unchecked consumption distorts the spirit. Hollow eyes were another deliberate choice, carved deep into wooden masks or woven into ceremonial textiles. In Iroquois tradition, these empty sockets symbolized the Teiheehan's soulless nature, reflecting their existence outside the natural order. Some tribes used reflective materials like polished stones in the eye cavities, so when firelight flickered during storytelling ceremonies, the figures seemed to gaze malevolently at the audience. It was a masterclass in psychological horror, centuries before modern special effects. Colors told stories too. Many eastern woodland tribes painted Teiheehan representations with ashy grays and bloody reds, not randomly, but to tie them to specific warnings. Gray evoked the pallor of corpses, linking the dwarves to burial taboos, while red mirrored both violence and the sacred lifeblood of the hunt. Even the materials held meaning. A Kwakwakawakwa mask might use cedar bark for hair, connecting the creature to the very forests it haunted. Perhaps most striking is how these artistic rules varied by tribe, yet shared core themes. A Hopi Kachina doll carving of a Teiheehan would emphasize dislocated limbs, representing spiritual imbalance, while a Lakota painted hide might show them surrounded by broken bones, a direct nod to their cannibalistic reputation. Every stroke and hue was a deliberate language, preserving oral traditions in tangible form. Today, contemporary Native artists like painter John Quick-to-See Smith reimagine these motifs to address modern struggles, from environmental destruction to cultural erasure. Her Teiheehan-inspired works retain those signature hollow eyes but render them weeping oil, merging ancient warnings with current crises. It's proof that these artistic traditions aren't relics, they're living tools for storytelling, as sharp now as the dwarves' legendary teeth. With their visual legacy firmly rooted, we'll next uncover how legendary storytellers used voice and rhythm to make these horrors leap from the firelight into listeners' nightmares. Now let's step into the firelight circle where these stories truly came alive, through the voices of the master storytellers who shaped the Teiheehan myth. Among the Cherokee, elders like Swimmer could hold entire villages in terrified silence with his accounts of the dwarves. His technique was deliberate, starting with slow, almost playful descriptions of the forest at dusk, then sharpening his tone as shadows lengthened in the tale. Listeners would lean in as he'd drop his voice to a whisper when describing the Teiheehan's clicking teeth, only to suddenly clap his hands to mimic their attack. This wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural training disguised as horror. Up north, Iroquois storyteller Cornplanter took a different approach. His versions layered in humor before the horror, painting the dwarves as bumbling tricksters at first, until their laughter turned sinister halfway through the tale. Parents knew his stories taught children two lessons at once: never wander alone, and appearances can deceive. What seemed like foolish creatures were actually calculating predators, a metaphor for real-world dangers. The most chilling accounts came from the Lakota tradition, where storytellers like Lame Deer incorporated actual geography into their tales. He'd point to specific caves or twisted trees near the village, claiming Teiheehan still lurked there. This blurred the line between myth and reality, making the lesson unforgettable. His pacing was hypnotic, using drum beats to simulate heartbeat rhythms that quickened as danger approached in the narrative. What united all these tellers was their understanding of sound design long before the concept existed. Some would rustle dry leaves to suggest the dwarves creeping closer. Others used flute music that cut off abruptly when the cannibals struck. The Pueblo tradition even had storytellers trained to throw their voices, making it seem like Teiheehan whispers came from behind the listeners, a guaranteed way to make children sit bolt upright. These weren't random scare tactics. Every gasp-inducing moment served tribal values. The abrupt endings were victims who ignored warnings disappeared. That reinforced community obedience. The detailed descriptions of the dwarves, layers filled with bones, a stark reminder of what happened to those who broke food taboos during famine. Even the time of year mattered. Most tribes only told Teiheehan stories in winter, when the lessons about food conservation mattered most. Modern native storytellers, like Joseph Bruchak, keep these techniques alive today. Notice how his audiobook versions pause just before describing the dwarves' eyes, letting listeners' imaginations do the terrifying work. Unlike Hollywood jump scares, these stories weaponized anticipation, proving that the oldest horror tropes are often the most effective. Their genius lay in knowing that the monsters we imagine are always scarier than anything they could describe. This mastery of oral tradition explains why the Teiheehan endure as icons of horror, long before the concept of horror stories existed as we know it today. Now let's examine why, centuries later, these dwarf-shaped nightmares still tap into something primal within us. There's something timeless about the Teiheehan that keeps their stories alive, even centuries after they were first told. Perhaps it's because they tap into fears so deeply rooted in human nature, the dread of being watched, hunted, or worse, devoured. Think about it. In a world where we still jump at shadows and hesitate at strange noises in the dark, these cannibal dwarves embody the primal terror of the unknown. What makes them different from other monsters is their unsettling familiarity. They aren't towering giants or spectral ghosts. They're small, cunning, and hide in plain sight, much like real-world threats our ancestors faced. That's why tribal warnings about them weren't just about superstition. They were survival lessons wrapped in nightmare fuel. Never wander alone. Trust your instincts. Respect the wilderness. These aren't just old tales, they're coded instructions for staying alive. Modern horror thrives on similar fears. The feeling that something is just out of sight, the rustling leaves you can't quite place, the laughter that sounds just a little too wrong, all of these echo the Teiheehan's tactics. Even today, stories about them resonate because they exploit the same vulnerabilities, our fear of being powerless, of being outsmarted, of realizing too late that we've walked into a trap. But there's another reason these legends endure. They remind us that danger doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. In an age where threats often come disguised as something harmless, the Teiheehan's deceptive nature feels eerily relevant. Maybe that's why their stories still send chills down our spines. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the scariest monsters aren't the ones in the shadows, they're the ones that know how to blend in. And so, the Firelight stories continue, passed down not just as warnings, but as proof that some fears are universal. Whether centuries ago or now, the Teiheehan endure because they remind us that the unknown is still out there, waiting, watching, and hungry. From ancient campfire warnings to modern horror tropes, the Teiheehan have carved their place in our collective imagination. These cannibal dwarves aren't just relics of the past. They've slithered into our present, morphing into symbols of the unseen dangers lurking at civilization's edges. Tribal stories once used them to teach survival. Today, they inspire novels, games, and films, proving that some fears never fade. They just adapt. What makes them timeless isn't their grotesque appearance or hunger for flesh. It's how they mirror our deepest anxieties about trust, deception, and the vulnerability of being human. Every generation finds its own meaning in these tales. For Native American communities, they were cautionary tools. For settlers, they became twisted echoes of European goblins. Now, they're horror icons, reminding us that monsters don't vanish, they evolve. But here's the chilling question: could the Teiheehan still be out there, not as flesh and blood creatures, perhaps, but as shadows in our subconscious, waiting for the right moment to resurface? After all, the woods are still dark, the night is still silent, and sometimes, if you listen closely, you might just hear something laughing back at you from the trees. So what do you think? Have you heard whispers of the Teiheehan in your own local folklore? Drop your stories in the comments. Let's see how far these little nightmares have traveled. And if you crave more deep dives into mythical horrors, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a tale from the dark side of history. Until next time, keep one eye on the trail behind you, just in case.